Hello and welcome to the Core Outdoor Speaker Series. I'm your host, Jamie Moy, an adventure journalist based in the West Kootenays. Once a month, Core, Kootenay Outdoor Recreation Enterprise, produces this webinar to share valuable information in the outdoor rec tech space and to continue to strengthen its community of outdoor gear manufacturers, designers, and makers. For today's session, I'm pleased to welcome Erik Bronsvoort, an engineer, author, and circular economy expert. Erik is joining us tonight from the Netherlands, where it's 7 p.m., and that's where he founded his company, a consulting and project management organization. It's called Circular Cycling. I'm also pleased to be wearing a Ride Fast, Raise Hell t-shirt by Wild Rye. This is a women's outdoor apparel company based in Idaho, and Wild Rye's founder, Casey Abel, was the guest on Core's podcast last month. If you're not already tuned in to the Core podcast, we've produced 26 fantastic episodes already, available anywhere you get your podcasts and also on YouTube. Before I turn this floor over to Erik, I wanted to mention that the inspiration for today's webinar comes from Revolutions, a short documentary about bike waste produced in 2023 by a professor at Queen's University here in Canada and affiliated with the University of British Columbia's Center for Sport and Sustainability. A big takeaway from that film is that cycling is perceived as a green technology, which it is when you're comparing riding a bike versus taking a car for transportation. But that doesn't mean the cycling industry is green or sustainable. As a backgrounder, I'm going to share a few data points from the film. So in a study done in 2011, Specialized estimated that they needed 65,000 liters of water to manufacture a specialized Roubaix frame, the equivalent of filling an average-sized swimming pool. Bike tires take 50 to 80 years to decompose in the landfill. An aluminum frame takes 250 years, and bike tire inner tubes take over 1,000 years. How many bike tubes are thrown away every year? In the US alone, it's enough to fill the Empire State Building 8 times. There's a segment in that film where Erik says it's actually easier to repair a bike built in the 1980s than now, because these days parts are really specific to a frame. But the manufacturers only offer replacement parts for about 5 years. You literally can't get what you need. And now I'm starting to steal Erik's thunder, so I'm going to stop talking. Erik, the floor is officially yours. If you could please go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you, and nice to be here, everyone. The reason why I'm here is because I have a dream, and that dream is to ride the bike of the future. I'm based in the Netherlands, in a place called Utrecht. I just added a picture to my presentation to give you an idea of sort of the place where I am. I grew up riding a bicycle. My parents never even owned a car, so we did everything by bike and train. Cycling in the Netherlands is sort of as normal as walking is, and we take cycling for granted and as a green mode of transport. I've been trained as an engineer. I worked in the construction industry for a very long time, and I've been involved in sustainability projects for about 15 years now. And I like riding a bicycle, whether it's a road bike, whether it's my commuter bike to get to work or to the shop, a mountain bike or a gravel bike, doesn't really matter. I do travel a lot around Europe to go to nice places to ride as well. And on one of those trips, one of my friends said to me, well, Erik, you've been talking to me for 4 hours about this sustainability project of yours, but this latest carbon fiber mountain bike that you've got in the back, that has nothing to do with sustainability. And it really sort of hit me that I've been talking about, I don't own a car, I cycle everywhere. And then all of a sudden my friend says that cycling is not sustainable. And we've been talking about sustainability in the bike industry on that trip pretty much every single day. And what happened is that we continued that conversation about why the cycling industry has never been like the outdoor industry, talking about the topic of sustainability. And this is about 7, 8 years ago now. And together with my friend, at some point, we decided we needed to do something to introduce the concepts of the circular economy to the bicycle industry. So we set up a shop called Circular Cycling, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later on. We ran that shop for a couple of years, and after that we decided that if we wanted to change the industry for real, then we had to do something different than getting our hands dirty in that shop. So we wrote this book called From Marginal Gains to a Circular Revolution, in which we describe our ideas on how the cycling industry can transform from this linear economic system to what is called a circular economic system. In today's workshop webinar is a short version of a 3-hour workshop I'm offering to anyone in the cycling industry to sort of get them started in what it's like to go from this linear economic system to becoming a circular company, and how that involves business models and circular design. And because we're a nice small group, an hour is short, but there is enough room for questions. And I know that there's a couple of people in the audience that already have a list of questions. So what we did is we said, after sort of my introduction about the linear and the circular economy, we'll have room for Q&A, part 1. So if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat or raise your hand during the question and answer part. Before we'll go and dive some deeper into some business models and some circular design examples from some of my customers that I've been working with over the last few years, helping real bike companies to become more circular, more sustainable. And I always like to end my presentations with, okay, now you've been listening to me, maybe you've done some work, but how do you actually take that to your everyday job? And whether that job is in the bicycle industry or any other outdoor company, it doesn't really matter. These concepts of the circular economy work in every single hard goods or even soft good industry, basically. So I hope today will give you some insights about why the circular economy is so important, but also how you guys can, in your daily job, make a difference going from this linear economic system to the circular economic system. Any questions so far? Feel free to raise your hand. If not, then we'll move on to stage 1, the linear economic system. I always bring this timeline to my presentations. It's a timeline from the year 1900 in the bottom left towards 2050. And I've plotted 4 lines on this timeline. The population on our planet, the value of our economy, the mass of materials that we're extracting to make the goods that we consume, and the carbon emissions that we're emitting into the atmosphere as part of our economic system. So you see that we've been growing our population from 1900 till now, from about 1.6 billion to close to 10 billion people towards 2050. And our the way we measure our economy, the way we grow our economy, is measured in GDP. And that GDP has to grow in a similar shape because everyone just wants to get richer in the way we measure that. The way we measure that is by basically adding up all the money that we make by selling goods. And we sell goods that have to be made from materials. So we're extracting more and more materials from the earth to make the products that we're consuming. From 7 gigatons in the year 1900 to about 177 gigatons in 2050 if we don't change anything. And the whole process of extracting materials, turning iron or bauxite into steel or aluminium, and then into products is very energy consuming. And as long as we're using fossil fuels, that leads to carbon emissions. And the carbon emissions are probably the biggest short-term environmental risk that our planet is facing. And in 2022, the IPCC, the report from, or the organization from the UN that monitors the climate, said that CO2 emissions must peak by 2025 if we want to have a chance of meeting the Paris goals from 2015. So ideally 1.5 degrees in warming. If things go worse, maybe 2 degrees would also be okay, but we really don't want to get beyond that 2-degree warming. So that means that this year, global CO2 emissions will need to peak and quickly go down. The problem is that we're stuck in this economic system, this linear economic system, in which we take materials from the earth, we make a product, and then we waste that quite soon after we've been starting to use that product. So the question is, what to do? How do we change this economic system? The easy answer is more bikes and less cars. And that is true until you start thinking about all the bikes that have never been made to replace cars. And even those bikes that have been made to replace cars are sort of part of this whole system of trying to sell more products. So I've taken a picture from a brand in a year, and it could have been any other brand in pretty much every single other year in the last 20, 25 years. And it says that nothing is light, or this is lighter, stiffer, and more aero than its predecessor. And the idea is to trigger you to really think about, hey, I need a new bike. So I want to sell more products as a brand, and I want to sell them faster. I want to sell to more consumers. I want to increase my market share. And the sooner the consumer needs a new bicycle, the better it is, because it gives me an opportunity to sell another product. But in this linear economic system of take, make, waste, this automatically leads to waste more, waste faster. And the result of that is a lot of valuable materials that end up in the bin. So the linear economy is working in the concepts of selling more, selling faster, and the result is that we waste more and we waste faster. So when we ran our shop, we really found what we call, so we got our hands dirty. We literally built new bikes made from as many used parts as possible. Because we found that pretty much every single cyclist seems to have this box in their shed with bike parts that are too good to throw away, but they will likely never use again. So we started collecting those bike parts, and we built new bikes with as many used parts as possible, added some new tires, a new bar tape for hygiene reasons. But we were pretty successful in reusing a lot of very good parts that were just laying around somewhere. But during that process, apart from the very dirty hands and the occasional swearing, we also found that products were often designed to fail, designed to be outdated, and to be out-fashioned. Fail in the sense that a little bit of extra material in the right place would make them last forever, but the material was taken out because you wanted to make them as cheap as possible or as lightweight as possible. Products were designed to be outdated. The picture of this giant bike has a 9-speed 105 group set, and finding a replacement part for example, the shifter, even 5-6 years after the introduction of the shifter is really difficult because Shimano changed to 10-speed or to 11-speed. I think Campagnolo now has 13-speed on their road group sets. And finally, fashion is not just for the fashion industry, it's something for the bike industry as well. If your friend shows up with the latest and greatest bike, then every single human being gets this feeling, ooh, that might be something for me too. So all strategies to try to sell more products to existing customers maybe. Now, what this linear economic system looks like in a sort of a different model is this. This is called a value hill. And what you see again here is the 3 life stages of a product: the pre-use, the use, and the post-use phase. And in the pre-use phase, we add value to materials by extracting them from the earth. We manufacture parts, assemble that into complete products. And at the end of the retail phase, the value of that product is at the highest possible point when a customer is willing to pay a certain amount in the shop. He or she then uses that product for a while, and at the end of the lifetime, when the product is thrown away, the value of that product is very quickly destroyed in the incineration or in the landfill. Sometimes stuff gets recycled, but in general, there's very little like high-level recycling. It's more like downcycling. And that leads to a lot of waste. So there's not just economic waste, but also ecologic waste in this system. Ecologic waste in the sense that we need to mine all these products and we leave big holes in the ground where the mining is taking place, leading to biodiversity loss, for example. There's a lot of transportation involved, even building roads from the mines to the ports and the port itself. There's ecologic waste in the waste incineration, in landfilling, acidification of the oceans, microplastic, forever chemicals like PFAS, etc., etc. It's all part of this linear economic system trying to produce goods and try to sell as many as possible. There's also a lot of economic waste in this linear economic system. Production waste, overproduction, over-engineering. We see a lot of excessive components and specs that come with package for whatever reason, but you never actually use. There's a lot of defects, but there's also indirect economic waste. For example, the waste tax that every one of us is paying to dispose of all the waste that we generate on a daily basis. Climate mitigation measures. I'm not sure about what's going on in your area in Canada when it comes to climate change or the impact of it, but where we are in the Netherlands, we have got some serious water issues, both rising sea levels as well as extreme weather events. And combating these events is going to cost us a lot of money to build dikes and all the rest of the stuff that we need to get rid of all the water. And even more expensive is disaster relief. So when something actually happens, how do you take care of all the people and the infrastructure that's been destroyed by the climate change? So there are very good reasons to stop operating in this linear economic model. And what we want to try to do is move towards a circular economic model. To give you an idea of what I would like to see in the cycling industry happening, I've made a little video.
Imagine the material wearing from your tires is biodegradable, that the lubricant washing from your chain no longer pollutes the forest, but provides valuable nutrients. Imagine a bike made from plant-based or recycled materials or reused parts. You no longer throw away your old bike like a piece of rubbish. Instead, you return it to the manufacturer so it becomes a resource for new bicycles. You will be living in a world with a circular economy. A world where you ride your bike in an environment without pollution, through forests larger and more biodiverse than today. A world where CO2 emissions no longer cause climate change, where we no longer dig up finite resources from the earth, but use our waste and renewable resources to make new products. To make the transition from our linear take, make, waste economy to a circular economy. Marginal gains are not enough. To get there, we need a revolution.
So the title of the book is From Marginal Gains to a Revolution. I really think we should stop making products with tiny little improvements in order to try to sell more of them to the existing market, but really go for a new economic system, which is a circular economic system, in which we do not use any finite resources anymore, in which there will be no pollution anywhere in the life cycle of the product, including CO2 emissions, and there will be no waste at the end of the lifetime. This is a very long shot, and I realize that, and I don't think even 2050, when sort of we have set the goal, at least here in Europe, to have a circular economy going, is feasible. But I definitely feel it's worth trying to get there as soon as possible. And the way to transition from our linear economic system towards a circular economic system is by trying to retain that value on that value hill that I showed you before. So here you see that same value hill for the pre-use, the use, and the post-use phase. And there's some important differences. First of all, in the pre-use phase, we've cleaned up our production processes. So there's no fossil fuels anymore, and there's no use of finite resources. So there's no need to make any new mines to get materials from the earth into the system. Instead, we get our materials from either bio-based sources or recycled sources. The use phase has been extended. So we make sure that products last as long as possible in order to have, the same functionality with less materials, by designing products that last for a very long time, and to make sure that maintenance and repair is very easy to be done. And the next step then is to retain value at the highest possible level of the value hill at the end of the lifetime of the first user of that product, by making sure it gets reused or redistributed to someone else that could be using that product, refurbish them or bring them back to the factory for remanufacturing. And if that's not possible, make sure that the product is recyclable properly. So don't sort of downcycle products, but really recycling. And if a product cannot be recycled for whatever reason, it should not be incinerated or landfilled. It should be possible to bring them back into nature to regrow into new plants, or at least become part of the circle of life again. So that was a sort of a very quick overview of the linear economic system, which you may recognize from your own cycling operations, or maybe you work in some other outdoor sports equipment, and then how to transition to a circular economic system. And I want to give you the opportunity to ask questions now before we head into some of the business models that make that value retention on the value hill possible from brands that have started doing that. So feel free to turn on the video, raise hands, put them in the chat, whatever you want.
Hey, Erik. It's JB. Are there some countries that are kind of ahead of this compared to other countries? I'm just wondering, like in North America, how we compare to Europe.
It's a fair question, I guess. The answer is, I think that Northwestern Europe is ahead of Canada from the message that I get with working with people in North America. One of the reasons is that where I live in the Netherlands, we are quite a small country. We don't have any space for example, landfills anymore. So there's a big pressure on how do you handle your waste. There's a lot of we've been scared by the invasion of Ukraine a few years ago, which was a real wake-up call that we need to become less reliant on fossil fuels from Russia, for example. So there's a big push to get towards more renewable energy and also to reduce our waste. And the European Union has set up a lot of rules, regulations to push us in that direction. So there's the goal to be fully circular and climate neutral towards 2050, and we should be about 50% less, how you say that, using less virgin materials towards 2030, and be about 50% on the renewable energy levels. So there's quite a lot of regulation being implemented here. Companies are forced to measure their carbon footprint, to measure their scope 3 emissions, so the emissions of the products that they make and how they're gonna deal with that. There's regulation coming up, which is called the right to repair. You may be familiar with that from other organizations, where companies are hopefully forced to make sure that products are repairable. So if a battery in your head unit fails, that you can at least replace the battery instead of having to replace your whole cycling computer, etc., etc. Then again, there's a lot of countries that do not really seem to care. And I must admit that also in the Netherlands, we are very good at exporting our waste to countries that have less stringent rules and somehow get rid of our shit somewhere else.
Wow. Thank you for that. That's so interesting. I've also got a question coming in on the chat from Nathaniel Fournier. He writes, living in an affluent town where riding the nicest and newest bike is the norm, and running a business much like your own, Original Used Bike Shop, how would you tackle the perception that new is better and make a repair reuse-based shop viable? Was yours viable in your market?
Mm-hmm. Mine was not, for multiple reasons. First of all, when we started, it was quite hard to find a customer base. So we knew that there's a lot of people interested in sustainability and circular products. And we did a lot of market research in other areas where sustainability was bigger than it is in the cycling industry. For example, in a lot of the outdoor industry here in the Netherlands, you can't buy a proper rain jacket without any tag saying I'm made from bio-based or recycled materials and please repair me. So we thought that would be a customer base. But what we ran into was that the quality of the products that we got back was quite poor, and the compatibility of the parts was really bad. So it took us quite some effort to create new bikes from as many used parts as possible, more than we expected, even though we had been working on our own bikes for about 20 years and working in bike shops together. We thought we could handle this, but we needed a lot more time, and therefore the bikes costed more than we intentionally wanted them to cost. And the next thing was that it was quite hard for us to find the customers. People in the Netherlands search for new bicycles or used bicycles online. So we spent quite a lot of money on Google and Facebook trying to lure customers into our web shop. But no one was actually looking for a refurbished bike, for example. They were all looking for a bike with discount or a secondhand bike, and ours were somewhere in the middle. So we saw a high bounce rate of people finding our website, looking around, thinking, "Oh, this is an expensive secondhand bike," or "This is not really this kind of bike I was looking for." There's literally no one looking for sustainable bicycle or circular bicycle or whatever. So it was quite hard to find customers. But where I live, Utrecht is very different from the places where you guys live. So if you live in a town where a lot of people buy new bikes, then the quality of the bikes on the secondhand market will probably be pretty good. and that will be pretty recent, I would imagine. But it's a matter of scale and trying to match the second-hand bike with a new customer. That is really the difficult thing, and I'll come to talk about that later on in the presentation of a good example of how that could work.
Thanks, Eric. And Paul Kelly chimed in. If everyone wants to open up the chat, he gave a great example of a used repair-based bike shop in Frederick, Maryland, that also has a great YouTube channel with good business advice. And he included the link there. It's recyclebicyclesshop.com. And then another question coming in from Julian Mills, who writes, what period of life cycle impact do you consider reasonable when assessing a design for a circular bicycle? So considerations for a project over 30 years versus 300 years could be quite different.
Yeah. So the interesting question is, for what sort of life cycle are bicycles designed now? And the best bikes that we see in the Netherlands were the bikes that were bought by my grandparents. So in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where they invested in a bicycle, which was an expensive product, but they were really nice bicycles and they last a lifetime. And in the change that we've seen from made to order to mass production in Asia, and this whole thing of trying to sell more bikes in existing markets, we've seen that the quality of bikes has been decreasing. So it's getting harder to maintain them well. They last less long, and it's also getting more expensive to maintain them. So it would be great if bicycles would still last for 30 years, but I have not seen any mountain bikes, road bikes, or performance bikes out there for such a long time. So I think 30 years, if we could make that for a bicycle, that would be awesome. Especially if you consider that you need to do, you have to replace some parts over the lifetime of the bicycle, and they still need to be there, compatible bicycle parts. So they also ask something for the supply chain to stop introducing all sorts of new standards in order to make that happen. 300 years, I think that's a very long time. It would be nice if they would still be there, but I guess making the step from the 5 or 6 years that we see here to 30 years would already be a massive improvement.
Yeah, well said. And then from C. Burns, how can different levels of government support this transition from linear to circular bikes?
Yeah, so I think there's a need for regulation on waste. I think we really should try to limit the amount of waste that we produce and making sure that everything that is discarded somehow gets back into the system, but more important even that we try to minimize the amount of waste that we generate. And for example, the right to repair options, the need for recycled content in products. That's something else you see in the Netherlands now. Plastics, for example, will need to have a certain percentage of recycled content. Batteries will need to have a certain percentage of recycled content. So we generate a market for recycled materials is definitely going to help. What I also think is that there's a huge opportunity for local governments to start introducing cycling as a mode of transport via, for example, the bike sharing schemes, where you have either a docked or a free floating bicycle system in your town that everyone can use. So you have a high use rate for a lot of different people that can use that same product without every one of you having to buy a bicycle to get around town. So that's something the local governments can do. But yeah, changing the cycling industry as a whole, I think the most important government body is the UCI, the Global Cycling Union, because I really think that they have a key opportunity to change the way they allow bicycles in competition. So can you imagine what would happen if a team in the Tour de France can only take one spare bike per rider and one extra wheel set per rider, and the number of mechanics is limited to 2 instead of unlimited, and what that would do to the performance requirements of the bicycle. So they would have to be a lot more durable than the bikes that they currently use, where they change a chain, for example, every day, or they just take a new bicycle for every single type of stage, and how that would trickle down into the rest of the industry. So you've got your normal governments, but then there's also the cycling government, the UCI, that can have a big impact on circularity.
Thanks, Eric. We've also got some of the hardcore cyclists and bike builders chiming in here. So
Steel and titanium, yeah. But that's an interesting question. I get it all the time. Should I buy a carbon fiber, a titanium, or a steel bike?
yeah,
And
Kevin's
they
like
all have their advantages and disadvantages. But the problem, if you buy a titanium bike or a steel bike for life, is that if Shimano or SRAM stops using the compatible, making the compatible derailleurs or shifters, then it's really nice that you have this super, like this bike that lasts a whole lifetime. But if there's no longer compatible spare parts to keep it running, then you still have a problem. And at some point there's a tip where the environmental impact of the bike is no longer, well, it's usually the biggest in the frame set because it's the heaviest component. But after you've been replacing 3 or 4 chains and cassettes, then that is tipping towards the wearable parts on the bicycle. So the real environmental impact is not with the frame set, as long as you maintain your stuff well, but in the stuff you replace during the lifetime of the bicycle.
And Kevin just wrote, agrees with that. I've got another question from Michael Hoer. He says that nowadays everything gets electrified, bikes included. How does that factor into the conversation and practice regarding circular economy in Holland and other countries?
I hate all the e-systems because they are a nightmare for longevity of products, for compatibility of products, and also for sort of the added benefit that they bring. So, for example, here in the Netherlands, we've got a perfectly flat country where everyone could cycle around on a very nice bicycle. We've done that for 100 years. And now the biggest trend is that everyone needs to have an e-bike because, you know, it's the thing. Everyone needs an e-bike. And it turns out that the average speed of a normal cyclist on a cycle path is about 21.5 kilometers per hour, and of an e-biker 23 kilometers per hour. So there's very little difference, but the bikes get more expensive and the environmental impact of the bike is also getting more expensive. And what we see is that if an engine or a battery fails, that is often a very expensive part. And even if you are able to find a compatible part, and there's about 100 different standards of motors, which none of them are compatible between the motor and the frame set. So if you have a Bosch engine and it fails, you want to install a Shimano or a Bafang engine into that same frame set, it is impossible. And it's quite likely even that if your Bosch engine fails, you cannot even find a replacement Bosch engine to go into your frame set. So if the e-bike fails, what often happens is that you have to replace the entire bicycle. And there is nothing circular about that. What I do see, on the other hand, is that in countries like Germany, where cycling has not been as big as it is in the Netherlands, and it's a little bit hillier than it is here, the e-bike is definitely getting people out of the cars and onto bicycles. So, and that's the sort of the other end. It's always better to get people out of cars and onto bikes. And if an e-system is required to do that, that's perfect. But there's a big challenge in the e-bike industry to increase compatibility, longevity, repairability, etc., etc.
Thanks for that, Eric. And I know everyone here, at least in British Columbia, is thinking, well, it's extremely steep and hilly here, so it's been more of a similar situation in Germany. All right, I think we are ready to move on.
Cool. All right, so it's all nice to tell you that we should move to the circular economic system, blah, 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 but how do you actually do that? And I brought some examples of my own experience, but also with companies I worked with in the last few years. And the first one is the simplest one, and it's instant money making. It is to refuse all sorts of crap that we're adding to bicycles and all sorts of other products in the form of packaging, in the form of, for example, these bicycle lights. If you're cycling in the Netherlands, you need to have a light on in the winter time or in the darkness. Bike brands often save money on the lights that they install, and what then happens is that people go to the supermarket and buy these cheap lights that fall off bicycles all the time. They include a battery and some electronics, and then just fall on the street, and everyone leaves them there. So I think we should refuse to add all sorts of extras that we don't really need with the product, packaging, extra mounting options or whatever, and also start refusing these sort of throwaway items like these lights that are just too cheap to look after properly. And this is an instant money maker, both for the consumers as well as brands that can work with this. So if you get stuff from your supplier in, and every single item, if you order a box of 100 and every single item is packed in packaging, plastic, and then a cardboard box or whatever, reach out to your supplier and say, hey, I'm not interested in all these extra packaging. Just make sure it comes to us safely, but don't put it into nice packaging, for example. The second one is the Trek Red Barn Refresh program. So we talked about this used bike thing in the Q&A before, and when I worked with Trek, we found that there's a lot of people that have a old Trek in their garage somewhere that they don't use anymore. And what Trek wanted to do is to build their own second-hand market by getting all of these bicycles from the garages and sheds in the US back into their own facilities without overwhelming their dealerships with second-hand bikes and having to deal with the second-hand bikes. Because they're usually, if you're a shop owner, you have limited space, you don't have a lot of time to look after second-hand bikes. So what Trek did is basically said, okay, we're going to centralize this. You can go to the website, you can trade in your Trek in a quite easy way. So they measure the value of the bike via the Bicycle Blue Book. You trade it into your dealer, you get store credit for that bike. And then every now and then when there's a transport going on between the factory and the store, the transport goes back into the Trek facilities in Wisconsin, where they have set up a special production line for refurbishing used Trek bikes. And the idea was then to sell them via the Trek website, but then also have the pickup option at the local dealership. And then in that way, they create a lot of volume, so they can actually set up a proper production line. And they've also had the opportunity to relieve the local bicycle shops from that whole second-hand story by making the process very easy. What they found with this is at first everyone was quite skeptic. Yeah, but that means that we're going to sell less new bikes because we've got these second-hand bikes on our website. And it's all going to be a lot of trouble. And it turned out that most of the people that actually buy this used bike are completely new customers to the Trek family. So they're selling to a new customer base. What they also found is that they learned from their own mistakes. So what I learned in my shop a few years ago, when I tried to mix and match parts from different bicycle brands, Trek even struggles with refurbishing Treks. They need a lot of different tools. They need a lot of different bottom brackets, headset units, whatever, to keep Treks running. So it's a very good learning journey for their designers on what works and what doesn't work. And it's also an opportunity to empty all of the storage areas that they still had with some, specific bike parts for a certain bike from a certain year that now come through the refurbishment process. And instead of having to buy new headsets, for example, they go into their old storeroom and actually empty that old storeroom to put these parts into the bicycles. So it's a very good example of a very big company that is using their volume to build a system like this. And so far it's been interesting to follow. I'm not sure about the volume of bikes that they actually sell through the process, but even the learnings, so what does work and what doesn't work, what is easy to fix, what is not easy to fix, is super valuable information for the Trek engineers to improve the design of the future generation of Trek bikes. Another example is called pay for performance models. And you may or may not be familiar with these, but this is a company called Swapfiets. They are based here in the Netherlands. And what they found is that a lot of people really don't care about owning a product, but they just want to have the opportunity to use a product. So they basically said, well, we're going to provide students with a bicycle for 15 euros a month. And whenever it breaks down, they give us a call. We come and fix it on the spot. And if we can't fix it, we will swap it for another bike. And that bike can be a new bike, but it can also be a pre-used bike. It doesn't really matter. The customer is paying for the fact that the bike is actually running well, but not for the fact that it is a new bike. And what happens is that it makes the company completely responsible for the performance of that bicycle and how long it's running without failure. And what you see then is that they very soon find out that they need to standardize parts. They need to make service very easy, because every time a customer calls them, it's their problem and not the customer's problem. So it's hitting their own bottom line all the time. And they started with a fleet of bicycles that were like normal bicycles, and those bikes needed an average of 3 repairs per year. And within 2 years, by collecting data from 300,000 paying customers, they were quite well able to sort of find the hotspots of the parts that were failing most, and they've been improving their bicycles ever since, and are now back to an average of 1 repair per year. And that is a frequency that they quite like, because it also gives them the opportunity to look after the bike and give them some proper maintenance instead of having to wait until the bike fails. This bike is now, or Swapfiets is now operating in multiple countries in the Netherlands or in Europe, with 300,000 paying customers. So every month, 300,000 people pay a certain amount of money into the Swapfiets bank account, and in return, they get a working bicycle. So this is a very good example of where circularity, designing for long life, designing for easy maintenance and repair, is working with a certain business model that is far less dependent on the fluctuations of the market than all the other bike brands that we see here in the Netherlands. The good thing is it also gives them the volume towards the manufacturers and in the recycling process. So they're now working with multiple brands on, for example, the tires with Victoria, where Victoria doesn't supply tires and gets paid instantly, but Victoria is now part of this monthly pay for performance system. So for every tire they supply to Swapfiets, they get a certain monthly fee. And if the tire fails for whatever reason, they get a bill from Swapfiets. So the Swapfiets mechanic has to fix that tire. And if he does so, he scans a QR code on the side of the tire, and the invoice automatically goes to Victoria for the fact that he needs to replace that tire or fix that tire. And what instantly happens is that Victoria no longer supplies the cheapest tires they can sell, but they supply the best tires that last a very long time and need very little maintenance. So it improves the quality of the ride for the consumer. It's a better tire. It reduces the amount of failures, and it also reduces the amount of materials that go into tires at Swapfiets. So they last because they last longer. And finally, this is the first time ever that Victoria actually gets their tires back on a larger scale. So they get a lot more insights into how their tires wear, how long they last, and it gives them the opportunity to set up a proper recycling system. So they keep basically the bicycle in their own sphere. That gives them the opportunity to really go into that circular model. So that were the 3 sort of the business models. There's more described in the book, and there's also a lot of hybrids in between. So for example, for performance road bikes, where fit and look and ride quality is very important, this will not work, but maybe it will work if you buy the frame set and then get a subscription on the group set and the wheel set, for example, because, you know, who cares about whether it's a 12-speed or 11-speed Dura-Ace group set or a SRAM group set? They all function very well as long as they function. But if they start creaking and you need to get out to your bike shop to get that repaired, you often get a very large maintenance bill, and it's a lot of frustration. So there's hybrid models possible as well. One thing is important for every single one of those business models is to sort of rethink the design incentives. So maybe you remember from the beginning of my presentation, I said that the products are designed to fail, to be outdated, to be out-fashioned, because that works in the linear economic system. Sell more, sell faster, waste more, waste faster. In the circular economy, we need to make sure that products are designed to last forever, to be compatible and upgradable, to be easy to maintain and repair, and use the right materials. And last forever looks, for example, like a Schwalbe Marathon tire. They're famous for, you know, you can take these tires around the globe and they still last. Compatible and upgradable. This is an example of a company based here in Amsterdam. They basically have one cycle for life. So you buy this bike when you're 25, you take your girlfriend on the back of the bike, then all of a sudden there's a kid, so you need to transform it into a cargo bike. And then maybe after that, you turn it into a long tail bike. And the idea is that everything is compatible and upgradable, and then maybe downgradable, or maybe going from a cargo bike back to a normal bike, you perceive that as a upgrade at some point. But they design it in such a way that with a limited set of parts, they can turn it into a lot of different types of bikes. The third one is to make it easy to maintain and repair. Cannondale makes this happen, for example, via the app, but it's also important to think about how many different types of screws do you use on a bicycle. Canyon, for example, is now trying to put only T25 on all of their own components to make sure that you need less different tools to be able to maintain your bicycle. So this is an easy, a very important one to make it easier for a store to repair a bicycle, so they can get more throughput with the same amount of mechanics. Mechanics are also scarce, or help people to do the maintenance on their bicycles themselves. And the fourth one is to use the right materials. So the materials should be non-toxic, and then from bio-based or recycled sources. They should be designed with recycling in mind. So if you design something, already think about, if I'm gluing this, do I have an example here? Aluminium crank arm and wrap that with carbon fiber. Think about, is that still possible to recycle that properly, or will that end up in a landfill or an incinerator? And that will automatically lead to involved suppliers. You cannot do this on your own. You really need to go into your supply chains and think with your suppliers, how do you make this possible? And I've taken an example of a quite a wild project I've been working on. This bicycle helmet has been made from a mycelium hemp fiber composite material. And for those of you familiar with mycelium, it's the wood structure of fungi that you can grow into any shape if you make a mold. And if you combine it with fibers, it leads to a product like this. And we actually tested this in a lab, and it performed just as well as EPS when it came to the shock absorption. What we're now trying to find is a lot of money to get this to, something that can actually hit the market. But just to give you an idea, is that nature is probably the best example of, a problem solver for all sorts of different products. Mycelium can be used to replace EPS, a very harmful material. That was that. So the business models and the design incentives, and we're already quite close to the end of the hour. So let's have some more questions and answers now, and then I'll finish up my story later on. Any questions?
I'm not seeing anything in the chat yet.
From typing away with long questions. Kevin, I was promised that you would have a lot of questions as well.
Okay, well, I do have a question here. So I'll just come off a bit of typing, I'll just explain it. So we launched a rehab tour, which is a repair tour that's primarily geared towards soft goods like textiles.
Yep.
But in British Columbia, there is really no formal waste diversion path for cycling, whether it's frames, whether it's parts, whether it's tires, whether it's tubes. Nothing's really formalized. So is there examples in other countries or other regions? Maybe people know across Canada, are there regions or provinces that really have this dialed?
And the only example I have is a battery recycling system that has been set up by People for Bikes in the US. And there's a similar system operating in a lot of different countries here in Europe. But I think the battery is the only system I've heard of where sort of mass collection is taking place to properly recycle products. And this is a big problem.
Because in the outdoor industry, cycling is probably one of the easiest categories to recycle because the frames are of material, the parts are materials, the tires, the tubes, compared to say a Gore-Tex jacket that's multi-layers of different fabrics.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something that we would like to explore from a nonprofit to look at collecting this from a regional basis, and then to have a waste diversion path to whether it's tires or tubes or frames or parts.
Yeah. So I think the only easy stream is the inner tubes. And Schwalbe is doing this. They are collecting tubes in the Netherlands and Germany, and then they send them back in a container to their facilities in Indonesia, where they actually put the tubes, whether it's a Schwalbe tube or a continental tube, it doesn't really matter, into their production system as a alternative source of butyl. And it's from an environmental perspective, it's working, and from an economic perspective, it's working too. So there's definitely opportunities for tubes. But then bicycles are quite complex systems as well, similar to your outdoor jacket, because we mix a lot of different materials into parts which are quite hard to disassemble. So in even the most advanced recycling systems, it's quite hard to separate the carbon fiber from the steel, from the titanium, from the aluminium. And even if you're able to extract just the frame set and take out all the bolts and the headset, etc., then the frame set is probably a high grade aluminium 7005 or 6061 alloy, of which it's quite hard to distinguish from any other type of alloy that ends up in that same scrap heap. And what you often see is that the high-end alloys that we're using in the cycling industry gets downcycled into a lower grade aluminium because we simply don't have 10,000 kilos of 7005 frame sets to put into one of those big melting pots at a smelter. So there's a lot of downcycling going on in bicycles too, and yeah, a proper system for taking bikes apart at the end of life and then separating different materials and different streams would help. But again, it needs a lot of volume, and that is quite hard work at the moment. So it's probably not a good business case, and it will only happen, I think, if we set up a proper system to make that happen on scale. For example, like what is going on with the cars here in Europe, where you pay a fee up front to get rid of your car at the end of the lifetime, and with that fee, the car is disassembled, and the different material streams are put into the right direction.
One more quick question, Erik. Michael Hoher wrote in, is the government in the Netherlands inclined to change legislation to promote changes towards circularity?
Yes. Is it going fast enough? No. I would have liked to have seen this happen like 5 years ago, and they're still talking about the details of what we're going to introduce in the late 2020s. But there's definitely more and more regulation coming, and with the whole economic situation and also the safety situation in the world, we're quite dependent on China, for example. All the trade wars with the US aren't really helping. It's important for Europe as a continent to get less reliant on material resources from outside Europe. So it's a very good, positive, that's probably the only positive thing. It's a very good reason to start changing towards the circular economic system, just to keep the resources that we already have in Europe, to keep them in Europe and turn them into new products. Unfortunately, that's the reality.
Right, then before we move on, just a quick note from Ian Shapland. He's not sure if it's still going on, but up until recently in BC, in the Kootenays, bike tires and tubes could be bundleized and recycled with automotive tires. And Kevin said that unfortunately, recycling tires and tubes is not available in Kimberley.
Cool. All right, very quickly then. We need a revolution, and I need your help to make that happen. I realize at the same time that nobody is perfect, and that includes me, unfortunately. But I do think the cycling industry and the outdoor industry is super creative. And if there's any industry out there that can do this, I think it's us. But the most important thing is to start, and start small, however small it does. It doesn't really matter. As long as you start talking about this to your customers, to your suppliers, to your colleagues, to the people, your friends, whoever, we need to get this conversation going. And you will see that a lot more is going on than you would imagine, and there's a lot more possible than you would imagine. So I'm going to share this action plan in the chat with you, and I hope that you will make some time directly after this presentation to just sit down for a few minutes and think of 3 things you can do within, say, the next 3 months to make a difference. Could be something in your personal life. Get into your shed and find those bike parts that are still too good, but you will never throw away. Just put them on something like eBay, or something that you can do in your own business to just make a tiny little step towards circularity. And if you need any help, there's a few resources that I'd like to share before we stop. The first is this book, From Marginal Gains to Circular Revolution. You can find an ebook on my website, circularcycling.com, or hard copies on Amazon, which will be printed just for you and sent to your home address. And I've also got a 3-hour workshop if you want to get more into detail with your team or with a event, for example. I'm happy to help out there. The 15-minute documentary Jamie talked about before, Revolutions, is available on YouTube. We'll make sure to get you a link via email afterwards, Jamie, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
And I've also set up my own nonprofit organization called Shift Cycling Culture a few years ago. And that's a place where we bring the cycling industry together to talk about the topic of sustainability and actually get collaboration going on reducing the environmental impact. And one of the interesting ones is that we've set up a climate action training course in English, Vietnamese, and Mandarin, which will help you in about 20 hours to learn more about what does the climate impact of the cycling industry look like, how can you measure that for your own company, and then start reducing that. So it's available on shiftcyclingculture.com. Go and check it out. There's also a longer circular design course available there and some interesting online meetups similar to this one, where you can learn more from different companies in the bike industry on what they're doing to reduce their environmental impacts. That's it.
Brilliant. Erik, thank you so much. And thank you everyone who joined. This completes our webinar for May. Please mark your calendar for June 19th, next month's session. We'll be back at our regular time at 11:30 a.m. Pacific time. And Sam Cohen, the owner of Grip Publishing, will be joining us. Grip oversees Grip Climbing Magazine, Canadian Cycling, Canadian Running, and Triathlon Magazine. He'll be speaking about the ever-shifting state of outdoor media and everything that small businesses and brands need to know about working with outdoor media in 2025 and beyond.